My in-laws tried to sell my house while I was on vacation. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. From 4,000 miles away, I watched a stranger measure my bedroom for new curtains. I was sitting on a sun-drenched balcony in Bali, a plate of fresh papaya in front of me, the sound of the ocean completely drowned out by the roaring in my ears. I blinked hard, staring at the grainy security footage streaming to my phone, desperately hoping the poor Wi-Fi was somehow mixing up my camera feed with someone else's. But there was no mistaking the custom oak headboard I had built with my own hands, or the distinct shade of slate blue paint on the walls. This was my sanctuary. This was the house I had scraped, saved, and bled for. I bought this beautiful, 4-bedroom colonial in a highly desirable suburb a full 3 years before I even met my wife, Chloe. It was my pride and joy, entirely paid off, a fortress of stability in a world that had never handed me anything for free. I had always been fiercely protective of what was mine, perhaps to a fault, but seeing this intrusion validated every paranoid instinct I'd ever harbored. The stranger on my screen, a middle-aged woman in a sharp blazer, wasn't just looking around. She was pointing out the baseboards, gesturing toward the master bathroom, and nodding enthusiastically. She looked exactly like an agent showing a property to a prospective buyer. Have you ever felt like a trespasser in your own life? That sudden, sickening realization that the ground beneath you has vanished? My heart hammered against my ribs as I desperately tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding in real time. Chloe was inside the hotel room, blissfully unaware, humming softly as she unpacked her swimsuit. This vacation was supposed to be our ultimate escape, a 3-week remote getaway to disconnect from the stress of our daily routines. Instead, it was turning into the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. I hadn't given the keys to a house sitter, nor had I hired a property management company. I had given my keys to family. The people who were supposed to be our safety net had turned my sanctuary into a showroom. My hands shook violently as I pressed the screen to pan the camera toward the hallway. I zoomed in on the feed and finally recognized the woman holding the tape. To understand the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing, you have to understand my mother-in-law, Brenda. She is a woman whose entire existence revolves around appearances, social status, and projecting an image of immense wealth that she simply does not possess. When I first met Chloe, she lived in a modest apartment, working hard to pay off her student loans. I respected her drive. But Brenda? Brenda immediately fixated on my financial stability. I was only 28 when I bought the house, a massive achievement born from grueling 80-hour work weeks and skipping every luxury imaginable. I paid it off completely right before our wedding. Instead of being happy for us, Brenda viewed my property as an extension of her own personal empire. She would constantly make passive-aggressive comments at family dinners. "Oh, Michael, it's just so much space for 2 people. You should really let Arthur and me move into the guest wing," she'd laugh, though her eyes were always dead serious. Arthur, my father-in-law, would just stare at his plate, a quiet, defeated man who spent his life enabling his wife's delusions and covering up their mounting financial disasters. He was the paperwork guy, the one who juggled the maxed-out credit cards and shady personal loans to keep Brenda dressed in designer clothes. The tension reached a boiling point in the weeks leading up to our trip. Brenda had been dropping heavy hints about needing a massive loan to renovate their crumbling kitchen to host her country club friends. I shut it down immediately. "My money is tied up, Brenda," I told her firmly over dinner one night. "I'm not financing cosmetic upgrades." She glared at me, her face pinching with raw entitlement, and muttered something under her breath about how selfish I was with family resources. Chloe, as always, played the peacemaker, apologizing for her mother's abrasive tone and begging me to just ignore it. I loved my wife deeply, but her willful blindness to her parents' toxic behavior was a constant source of friction between us. I should have known that Brenda wouldn't just drop the issue, because a narcissist denied is a narcissist plotting. I thought setting a firm boundary would protect my assets and end the discussion right there. I had no idea my refusal was the exact catalyst that sealed my house's fate. The day before our departure was a whirlwind of packing, double-checking itineraries, and securing the house. We were heading out of the country for a remote, 3-week stay at an eco-resort that promised complete disconnection from the grid. It was meant to be our ultimate honeymoon redo. a chance to focus entirely on each other without the distractions of our demanding jobs or her overbearing family. The only logistical hurdle was our senior cat, Barnaby, who required daily medication, and my extensive collection of expensive indoor plants. Chloe had insisted, almost pleaded, that we ask her parents to handle it. They live 10 minutes away, Michael, she argued softly, folding her sundresses into a suitcase. It's easier than hiring a stranger off the internet, and my mom genuinely wants to help. Let her do this small thing for us. Against my better judgment, the suffocating knot in my gut screaming at me to say no, I finally relented. I handed Brenda my spare set of house keys in our driveway, the metal feeling inexplicably heavy in my palm. She snatched them with a tight, overly bright smile that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. Don't you worry about a single thing, kids, Brenda chirped, slipping the keys into her expensive, probably counterfeit, leather purse. Arthur and I will treat this beautiful home exactly like it's our very own. At the time, I thought it was just one of her classic, tone-deaf remarks, a desperate attempt to assert some kind of weird maternal dominance over my property. I gave Arthur a firm handshake, reminding him twice about the security alarm codes and the specific schedule for the cat's medication. He simply nodded, looking everywhere but directly into my eyes, his forehead beaded with a nervous sweat that I foolishly attributed to the humid summer air. As the Uber pulled away to take us to the airport, I glanced back at my house, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill wash over me despite the afternoon heat. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that my long-standing dislike for Brenda was clouding my judgment. Chloe squeezed my hand, promising me everything would be perfectly fine while we were away. The moment our plane lifted off the runway, the invasion of my home officially began. The first week at the resort was actual paradise, effectively lulling me into a false sense of absolute security. The Wi-Fi was wonderfully terrible, forcing us to keep our phones on airplane mode and truly disconnect from the world. We spent our days snorkeling in crystal-clear water and our evenings drinking cocktails under a canopy of stars. But on the morning of day 8, I hiked up to the resort's main lobby to quickly check my emails and download a new audiobook. The moment my phone connected to the spotty network, a flurry of notifications flooded the screen. Among the junk mail and work updates were 3 missed calls and a bizarre text message from Brenda. Hi, Michael. Hope the beach is lovely. Quick question. Where exactly does the property line end by the oak tree? And where is the breaker box? Barnaby is doing great. Zoxo. I stared at the bright screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. Why on earth would she need to know about the property lines just to feed a cat and water some ferns? And the breaker box? The house's electrical system was practically brand new and entirely flawless. I typed out a quick, cautious reply, telling her the breaker was in the garage and to leave the yard alone, but the message failed to send due to the weak signal. I tried to shake off the growing unease, chalking it up to Brenda's insatiable need to snoop through my things and micromanage everything around her. When I returned to our bungalow, I casually mentioned the strange text to Chloe. She just rolled her eyes and laughed it off, completely unbothered. You know how my mom gets, Michael, Chloe said dismissively, tossing a towel onto a chair. She's probably just obsessing over a dead branch near the fence and wants to hire someone to trim it so she can play the hero. Don't let her ruin your morning. I wanted to accept her logical explanation, to let the warm tropical breeze blow my mounting anxiety away. But a quiet, persistent alarm bell had started ringing in the back of my mind, a primal instinct warning me of danger. I decided to log into my smart home app just to take a quick peek at the front door camera. I stared at the loading screen until my blood ran completely cold in my veins. The smart home app on my phone simply refused to connect, displaying a bleak, spinning gray circle that mocked my rising panic. Every single interior security camera I had meticulously installed, the living room, the hallway, the garage, was listed as entirely offline. It wasn't just a glitchy connection. The system had been manually disconnected from the network or powered down at the source. My chest tightened as I repeatedly hit refresh, my thumb slamming against the glass screen, but the result remained the exact same. Complete and utter digital darkness. I immediately marched back to the lobby, practically shoving my phone up toward the thatched ceiling to catch a stronger signal, and dialed Brenda's number. It rang 5 times before she finally answered, sounding breathless and strangely irritated. Michael? We're extremely busy. Is there a problem? She snapped. I demanded to know why my entire security system was offline. Oh, that, she laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound that grated on my nerves. There was a massive power surge yesterday evening. It knocked out the router. Arthur is trying to fix it right now, but you know how awful he is with technology. Don't worry, the house is perfectly fine. Her story was entirely plausible, yet it felt inherently wrong, like a cheap lie rehearsed entirely too many times. Modern routers reboot themselves, and my system had backup battery power specifically designed for surges. Before I could interrogate her further, another notification popped up on my screen. It was a text from Dave, my vigilant, no-nonsense neighbor who lived directly across the street. Dave was a retired firefighter who noticed absolutely everything that happened in our quiet cul-de-sac. The text was short, blunt, and instantly terrifying. Hey man, didn't know you guys were moving. Want me to keep an eye on the guys loading the truck? Moving? A truck? My stomach dropped so fast I felt physically nauseous. I quickly replied to Dave, my fingers trembling as I typed. Not moving. What truck? Who is there? Seconds felt like agonizing hours before Dave's reply finally came through, accompanied by a blurry photograph taken from his front porch. The picture showed a massive white commercial moving van parked squarely in my own driveway. I stood frozen in the open-air lobby, the humid tropical heat suddenly feeling suffocating as I stared at the image on my screen. A generic white moving truck, the kind you rent by the hour, was backed up to my front porch. I could vaguely see Arthur's distinct, slumped silhouette standing near the open tailgate. This wasn't a power surge. This was a coordinated extraction. Adrenaline surged through my veins, sharpening my focus into a razor edge. I ignored Brenda's lingering lies in my head and immediately opened my mobile browser. If Dave thought I was moving, there had to be a reason. My hands were shaking so badly I misspelled my own street name twice before finally getting the search to go through. I clicked on the Zillow link that populated at the very top of the search results, praying it was just an old cache from years ago. It wasn't. There, staring back at me in high-definition horror, was my beautiful, custom-built sanctuary. The status badge in the top corner didn't say off-market. It aggressively flashed a bright, undeniable red. For sale. OFF market cash buyers sought. The listing details were a masterpiece of absolute deception. It described a highly motivated seller looking for a rapid closing. The asking price was easily $200,000 below market value, a desperate, fire sale number designed to attract bottom-feeding investors who asked zero questions. But the most violating part was the gallery of photographs. They had clearly been taken just days ago. My custom furniture had been entirely cleared out. My personal photographs were gone. The house had been brutally staged with cheap, generic rental furniture to make it look like a vacant, flip-ready property. They had systematically erased my entire existence from the home I built, repackaging my life's work as a quick, dirty payday to cover their own failures. Have you ever experienced a rage so intense that the world around you actually turned silent? I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone. I felt an icy, terrifying calm wash over my entire body as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. My in-laws weren't just stealing my furniture. They were trying to liquidate my entire home. I sprinted back to the bungalow, my bare feet slapping against the wooden boardwalk, clutching the phone like it was a live grenade. I threw open the door to find Chloe applying sunscreen, a serene smile on her face that instantly vanished the second she saw my expression. I didn't waste time with a gentle transition. I simply shoved the phone into her hands, the screen displaying the fraudulent listing in bright, undeniable pixels. Look at this, I demanded, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. Look at what your parents are doing. Chloe blinked, her eyes scanning the screen, and I watched her brain violently reject the reality in front of her. Michael, this is a mistake, she stammered, her face draining of color. It's a glitch on the website. Or a scammer using our address. You read about this happening all the time. She was desperately clinging to any absurd rationalization to protect her fragile image of her family. I snatched the phone back and pulled up the photo Dave had sent of the moving van, pointing aggressively at Arthur's unmistakable figure standing by the ramp. Is Arthur a glitch, Chloe? Is your father hauling my personal belongings into a truck a scammer? I asked, my tone uncompromising. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head in panicked denial. I immediately dialed Dave on speakerphone, needing an objective witness to shatter her illusions completely. Dave picked up on the second ring. "Dave, it's Michael. Tell me exactly what's happening at my house," I instructed him. Dave let out a heavy sigh. "Look, man, Brenda's been bringing people in suits through the place for 3 days. Today, Arthur's boxing up your books and hauling out the furniture. She told me you guys took a sudden job transfer overseas, and she was handling the sale." Chloe gasped, burying her face in her trembling hands as the undeniable, horrifying truth finally crashed down upon her. Her parents were actively liquidating our life. The betrayal was absolute, but the most pressing question was how they bypassed the law. I locked myself in the small hotel bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor to block out the sound of Chloe's quiet sobbing in the bedroom. I needed hard, legal facts, not emotional breakdowns. I dialed the emergency number for my real estate attorney, Robert, a ruthless professional who had handled the original closing on my house years ago. When I quickly explained the nightmare unfolding in my cul-de-sac, his usual calm demeanor instantly shifted into high gear. "Give me 10 minutes to pull the county records, Michael," Robert said, his keyboard already clacking loudly in the background. "Do not call them. Do not tip them off." Those 10 minutes stretching out in that cramped bathroom were the longest of my entire life. When Robert finally called back, his tone was completely grim. "Michael, they filed a power of attorney with the county clerk's office 4 days ago," he explained, the words hitting me like physical blows. "It grants Arthur complete authority to manage, sell, or encumber the property on your behalf. It's fully notarized and bears a signature that looks remarkably like yours." I felt physically sick. Arthur, the quiet, subservient enabler, had forged my signature on legal documents while Brenda played the mastermind. "Why?" I demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "How are they planning to get away with stealing a house?" Robert sighed heavily. "I did a quick background check on your father-in-law. Arthur is drowning in a massive sea of toxic, high-interest debt, unsecured loans, maxed-out credit lines, and it looks like some serious gambling markers that are dangerously past due. They are entirely desperate. They listed it for a cash-only, quick close to completely bypass the standard mortgage underwriting process, which would have easily flagged the fraudulent paperwork. They plan to take the cash, pay off their ruinous debts, and probably claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding when you return. They were betting their absolute financial survival on my absence and Chloe's eternal forgiveness. They assumed they could steal my greatest asset, clean up their miserable mistakes, and deal with the family fallout later. I realized right then that confronting them over the phone would be a catastrophic mistake. If I called Brenda and Arthur right now, screaming threats from a tropical island thousands of miles away, I knew exactly what would happen next. They would immediately panic, scatter like cockroaches in the light, and worse, they would completely hide all of my stolen personal belongings. I couldn't risk losing the irreplaceable heirlooms they had already boxed up and hauled away in that rental truck. I needed to catch them entirely red-handed, trapped in the very scheme they had so carefully constructed. I walked back into the main room, where Chloe was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "We are packing our bags right now," I told her, my voice eerily calm and utterly detached. "We are flying back immediately, but we are not telling a single soul that we are leaving this resort early." Chloe looked up at me, her expression a mix of deep sorrow and genuine fear. "Michael, what are you going to do to them?" she whispered, terrified of the answer. "I am going to let them proceed," I explained, outlining the ruthless trap forming in my mind. "I'm going to let them bring their sketchy cash buyer into my home, let them present the forged paperwork, and then I am going to walk through my own front door and watch their entire world burn." It was a brutal plan, but Chloe didn't argue. The sheer magnitude of her parents' deception had finally shattered the lifelong pedestal she had placed them on. She silently stood up, grabbed her suitcase, and began aggressively throwing her clothes inside. I contacted the airline and paid an exorbitant, painful fee to secure 2 seats on the next outbound flight. Then, I texted Dave, swearing him to absolute secrecy and asking him to monitor the house continuously. The vacation was officially dead, entirely murdered by greed and entitlement. As we boarded the tiny shuttle to the airport, I didn't feel sadness or disappointment over the ruined trip. I only felt a cold, calculated hunger for absolute justice, and a devastating legal reckoning. The 20-hour journey back to the States was an agonizing blur of stale cabin air, terrible coffee, and unrelenting, simmering rage. While Chloe slept fitfully beside me, her head resting against the cold airplane window, I spent every waking second coordinating the ambush over the expensive in-flight Wi-Fi. I was not going to leave a single loophole for Brenda and Arthur to exploit. My lawyer, Robert, was an absolute machine. By the time we crossed over the Atlantic, he had successfully filed an emergency injunction with the county to freeze the title of the house, ensuring that even if they miraculously rushed to closing, the deed transfer would bounce back as invalid. He also gathered all the necessary evidence: the forged power of attorney, the timestamps of our flights proving I was out of the country, and copies of my actual, verified signature for immediate comparison. More importantly, Robert utilized a connection at the local police precinct to brief a detective on the ongoing felony fraud. Fraud of this magnitude, especially involving real estate forgery, is extremely serious. Michael, Robert typed in a secure message. The police will be quietly stationed out of sight near your street tomorrow afternoon. When the buyers arrive to finalize the walkthrough, you give the signal. I stared at the glowing screen in the darkened cabin, mapping out the precise timing in my head. I had to time my entrance perfectly. If I walked in too early, they could claim they were simply showing the house to friends. I needed them actively engaging in the fraudulent transaction. I needed the cash buyer to have the counterfeit documents in their hands. As the plane finally began its descent into our home city, my exhaustion completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, electric adrenaline. We navigated through the airport like ghosts, completely avoiding the main exits and renting an inconspicuous gray sedan instead of taking a visible taxi. We were moving entirely in the shadows. We drove straight toward my neighborhood, ready to spring the trap on the greedy thieves. We parked the rented sedan in Dave's driveway, pulling all the way back behind his large, overgrown privacy hedges so the car was completely hidden from the street. Dave was waiting for us on his enclosed front porch, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee and a pair of high-end binoculars. He gave me a grim, silent nod as we slipped through his side door. "They've been over there all morning," Dave whispered, handing me the coffee. Brenda had a professional cleaning crew in at 8, and Arthur was hauling away the last of the garbage an hour ago. "She's treating the place like it's a $1 million open house." I peered through the binoculars, focusing on my own front door. The physical violation was staggering. They had hung a tacky, decorative wreath on my door, something I would never own, and carefully placed rented potted plants on the porch steps to boost the curb appeal. My stomach churned with a toxic mixture of anger and disgust. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a sleek, black luxury SUV slowly rolled into the cul-de-sac and parked directly in front of my house. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, holding a thick leather portfolio. This was him, the shadowy cash buyer Brenda had desperately secured to execute the rapid sale. A moment later, my front door swung wide open, and Brenda stepped out to greet him. She was wearing her best pearl necklace and a sickeningly sweet, welcoming smile that made my blood boil in my veins. She shook his hand enthusiastically, gesturing grandly toward the freshly manicured lawn before ushering him inside the house. Arthur trailed nervously behind them, clutching a thick manila folder tightly to his chest. "That folder has the forged deed and the fake power of attorney," I muttered to Dave, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked over at Chloe, who was pale and trembling, but she gave me a firm, resolute nod of absolute agreement. It was time to cross the street and reclaim everything they had tried to steal. I walked across the hot asphalt of the cul-de-sac, my footsteps feeling heavy and purposeful, with Chloe walking silently just a step behind me. I didn't bother knocking. I pulled my spare key from my pocket, slid it into the lock, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The house smelled intensely of artificial lemon cleaner and unfamiliar, cheap perfume. I stepped silently into the foyer, following the sound of Brenda's obnoxiously loud laughter coming from the formal dining room. "And as you can see, the natural light in here is just spectacular for entertaining," Brenda was saying, her voice echoing off the bare walls where my custom artwork used to hang. I rounded the corner and stood perfectly still in the arched doorway. Arthur saw me first. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, all the blood instantly draining from his face until he looked like a terrified corpse. The thick manila folder slipped from his trembling hands, scattering fraudulent documents entirely across the hardwood floor. Brenda, completely oblivious to her husband's panic, turned around with a wide, triumphant smile to address the buyer. Then, she saw me. Her mouth remained frozen in an open, grotesque shape, but the sound completely died in her throat. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely deafening. The man in the suit looked frantically between me, the terrified in-laws, and the spilled paperwork on the floor, clearly sensing the massive disaster unfolding. "Michael," Brenda finally gasped, her voice shrill and panicked, completely dropping the elegant persona she had cultivated for the buyer. "What? What on earth are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Bali for another 2 weeks." I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I simply stared at her with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt that made her physically step backward in sheer terror. "I decided to come home early, Brenda," I stated clearly, my voice dripping with cold, unyielding authority. "I heard you were hosting an open house, and I really didn't want to miss the closing." The buyer immediately backed toward the door, but the police were already waiting outside. The buyer didn't say a single word. He just practically sprinted for the front door, leaving his expensive pen on the table. He threw open the door, only to be immediately greeted by 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective stepping onto the porch. The detective confidently walked into the dining room, flashing his badge at Brenda and Arthur, who were now trembling uncontrollably. "Arthur and Brenda Higgins?" the detective asked, though it clearly wasn't a question. "We received a credible report regarding a fraudulent real estate transaction and forged legal documents occurring at this address." Brenda's polished mask completely shattered. She began frantically pointing her trembling finger at me, her voice rising to a hysterical screech. "He's lying. This is a massive misunderstanding. Michael gave us permission to sell the house because he owes us money. He's trying to set us up," she screamed, her lies becoming increasingly unhinged and entirely pathetic. I calmly pulled out the thick file my lawyer had meticulously prepared and handed it directly to the detective. "Here is the forged power of attorney they filed with the county 4 days ago, completely bearing a fake signature," I explained clearly. "And here are the flight records proving I was over 4,000 miles away when this document was supposedly notarized in my physical presence." Arthur completely collapsed into one of the rented dining chairs, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly. He didn't even try to deny it. The overwhelming weight of his massive debts and his wife's criminal scheme had finally crushed him. But Brenda refused to surrender. She turned her venomous gaze toward Chloe, expecting her daughter to save them like she always did. "Chloe, please," Brenda begged, reaching out desperately. "Tell them your husband is insane. We are family. You owe us this." Chloe stepped firmly out from behind me, looking at her mother with a cold, hollow expression I had never seen before. Her lifelong blinders were finally, permanently removed. Chloe looked directly into her mother's eyes and delivered the final, devastating, absolute blow. "I don't owe you absolutely anything, Mom," Chloe stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You tried to steal our entire future. You are completely dead to me." The detective didn't need to hear anything else. He calmly read Arthur and Brenda their Miranda rights as the uniformed officers stepped forward with metal handcuffs. Watching my arrogant, entitled mother-in-law being forcefully escorted out of my own front door in silver bracelets was a surreal, intensely satisfying experience that I will never forget. The immediate legal fallout was swift and absolutely devastating for them. Arthur cracked under the pressure during his very first interrogation, completely confessing to forging my signature and orchestrating the fake notary seal to cover their massive, secret gambling debts. Brenda stubbornly maintained her delusional innocence, claiming she was a victim of her husband's poor financial planning. But the digital trail of her coordinating the fake listing and hiring the staging company cemented her absolute guilt. They were both formally charged with multiple counts of felony forgery, criminal conspiracy, and attempted grand larceny. Within 48 hours, under the threat of severe additional charges, Arthur finally revealed the exact location of my stolen belongings. They had rented a cheap, climate-controlled storage unit 2 towns over, entirely paid for with a dangerously maxed-out credit card. Dave kindly brought his pickup truck, and together we spent an exhausting, emotionally draining weekend hauling all of my custom furniture, personal photographs, and precious heirlooms back into the house where they rightfully belonged. The physical space was finally restored to normal, but the emotional damage inflicted upon our family dynamic was utterly profound. Chloe spent the next several weeks in a deep, agonizing state of grief, mourning the sudden, violent loss of the parents she thought she knew, while grappling with the horrifying reality of their true nature. The house was mine again, but the long, difficult journey toward actual healing was just beginning. It has been over a year since that terrible afternoon, and our lives look entirely different now. Arthur and Brenda are currently serving significant prison sentences for their extensive crimes, their fragile, fake empire of wealth completely reduced to absolute ash. They lost their own heavily mortgaged home to the bank, and their country club friends vanished the very second the scandalous news broke in the local paper. Chloe completely honored her promise. She has maintained absolute, uncompromising no contact with them since the day they were forcefully arrested in our dining room. We spent months in intensive couples counseling, working incredibly hard to rebuild the trust that her parents' massive betrayal had so deeply fractured. It wasn't easy, and there were many long nights filled with tears and brutal honesty, but facing that horrific trauma together ultimately made our marriage infinitely stronger. Chloe finally learned how to establish rigid, healthy boundaries, and I learned how to let go of my lingering resentment toward her past blindness. My house, once a fortress I guarded fiercely against the world, feels completely like a shared home again. We finally took that rescheduled vacation to Bali, but this time, we hired a licensed, heavily bonded, and highly reviewed professional pet sitter to watch over Barnaby. To anyone watching this video who is currently dealing with entitled, toxic, or financially manipulative family members, please listen to me very carefully. Always trust your initial gut instincts. If someone constantly disrespects your boundaries regarding minor things, they will absolutely trample over your boundaries regarding massive things when given the opportunity. Protect your hard-earned assets meticulously, establish clear legal safeguards like trusts or prenuptial agreements if necessary, and never apologize for fiercely defending the stable life you have successfully built. True family is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary from the storm, not the absolute cause of the hurricane. You owe absolutely nothing to the people who try to steal your peace and your future.